today, so I guess we will get started and more people will be popping in along the way. But want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. This is definitely going to be a really enlightening conversation. I'm Rob Norquist. I'm the president of the Newport Beach Association of Realtors and want to welcome you all here. This is an important topic that is affecting much of the western coastline. We're going to have the sea level rise presentation, and we're going to hear from a number of cities on where that local city is in their mitigation efforts. Everyone is going to have the opportunity to ask questions of each city, Dr. Griggs, and the Realtor Group's Smart Coast California representative. We've got quite a nice panel in here, and I'm going to make some introductions to everybody that's on here today with us. First of all, I want to start with Dave Stefanides, the CEO of the Orange County Realtors. We also have Dira Sidone, the Government Affairs Director of Orange County Realtors. Bobby Jordan, the Executive Vice President of the Laguna Board of Realtors. Jesse Broza, the Chair of Government Affairs Committee for the Laguna Board of Realtors. Kimberly Foreman, the CEO of the Newport Beach Association of Realtors. Ricky Ramos, the Senior Planner with the City of Huntington Beach. We've got Simone Jurgis, the Community Development Director with the City of Newport Beach. Mark Weiner, the Community Development Director with the City of Laguna Beach. John Ciampa, the Community Development Senior Planner with the City of Dana Point. Brenda Wisniewski, the Community Development Director with the City of Dana Point. In addition, we also have the Realtor Associations of California have formed Smart Coast California, which promotes and advocates for private property rights and smart land use, political policies in coastal regions. And Don Schmitz with Schmitz and Associates is joining us and is representing Smart Coast California. We are also lucky to have Dr. Gary Griggs, a distinguished professor with the University of California, Santa Cruz, and he's a professor of earth sciences. Dr. Griggs' area of expertise is the coastal process and hazards, coastal engineering, impacts, and adaptation to sea level rise. We're going to be entertaining questions throughout the meeting today. So if you'd like to add them into the Q&A field or the chat feature, please feel to do so either way you feel comfortable with. If you have a question for a specific city representative, please identify the name of that city in the question along the way, and we'll be sure to do our best to make sure it's addressed. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gary Griggs. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. And I guess as long as, well, I think we're good already. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. I wasn't exactly sure how large this group would be, but when you're on Zoom, you don't really know anyway. So my intent this afternoon is to talk a little bit about global climate change and sea level, and then come down to sort of what the future might look like, what we know, what we can project for the Southern California coast, and then what some of the options or paths forward might be. So this is actually the Bay Bridge in San Francisco, showing what high tide is like today without any additional sea level rise. So there are a number of places where we're already experiencing, particularly on the East Coast, what's called sunny day flooding from very high tides. Just very quickly, there's really no scientific question that the planet is warming. And this is just sort of temperature anomalies or differences from an average that was taken from 1900 to 1960. So that becomes zero, the average global temperature for that 60-year period. And this extends over 140 years from 1880 to 2020. And what you can see in the first, 40 or 50 years of that, from this average, it was below that average by half a degree or so, quarter of a degree. And since then, it's been progressively warming. So we're now almost 2 degrees above what the global average was between 1900 and 1960. And the years continue to get warmer. And 19 of the warmest years since 2000 have occurred in the last 20 years. So the trend is pretty clear. This looks complicated, but it's really pretty straightforward and really just trying to show the relationship. This goes back from zero today, back about 450,000 years. And a lot of this is coming from ice cores in the Antarctic, from sediments in the deep sea floor, from records of where the shoreline was. So this is carbon dioxide. And you can see it occurs in these roughly 100,000 year cycles. And for actually at least the last 850,000 years, carbon dioxide was pretty constant in the atmosphere between maybe 175 parts per million and about 300 parts per million. It is now 412 parts per million. It's not a large amount, but it has a big effect on holding heat into the Earth's atmosphere. So it's now about 40% higher than it's been any time in the last 850,000 years. This is a plot of global temperature, which reflects those same 100,000 year cycles. There's some lags here, and there's also an interesting sort of relationship between carbon dioxide and temperature. Warmer Earth generates more carbon dioxide from several sources, and more carbon dioxide increases that blanket over the Earth and warms it up. And there's a close relationship between global temperature and sea level, which is on the bottom, these same 100,000 year cycles. The warmer it gets, the more the ocean water expands and the more ice melts. We could talk more about this, but I don't want to belabor it except to say these relationships are pretty well established. We now have good climate change records from a number of different sources that go back in the ocean 65 million years. As temperature changes in the ocean, the plankton, the organisms that live in the water, die, settle to the seafloor. We can core those sediments and sort of decipher what the climate was like throughout that 65 million year history. We have now collected ice cores in Antarctica that go back about 850,000 years. We've gone back about 11,000 feet into the ice. And as snow falls, it actually traps a little bit of atmosphere inside those layers. And when it freezes into ice, it's preserved, and we've gone back, cored that, and then looked at the chemistry to tell us what temperatures were like. In southeastern California, we have bristlecone pines that live to be about, well, as long as 5,000 years. And like many trees, they contain a climate record in their rings that we've now been pretty good at teasing out. And then, unbeknownst to many of us, we actually have deep sea corals off California, not reef building corals, but solitary corals. These live as long as 2,000 to 5,000 years, and we've collected some of those, cut through their stalks, much like a tree ring, and we can actually pull climate records from those as well. So this is just going back about 375,000 years here on the bottom, and this is showing what sea level has done over that last 375,000 years. So it's been higher than today, and what we're calling zero today is this red line. But what you can see is any other time in the last 375,000 years, sea level was someplace else. It's risen when we go into an interglacial period when ice melts and seawater expands. When we go into a cold period, we freeze water and then we melt the ice again and warm it. So we've gone through these glacial periods repeatedly. During the last glacial period, we dropped sea level about 400 feet. And in order to do that, or what caused that, was taking about 10 million cubic miles of seawater out of the ocean, and it went on the ice, I should say, went on the land as ice sheets and glaciers. But this is a pretty regular pattern. And what I think is important to note here with this, what we call zero today, is if we'd been here, say, 25,000 years ago, sea level would have been someplace else. And at the end of the last ice age, about 20,000 years ago, sea level was 120 meters, 400 feet below today. As it warmed, ice melted, the oceans expanded, we raised to where sea level is today. All of this went on totally in the absence of any significant human activity. So these are natural changes. What's happening today is changed from that. So I've just here taken that last warming interval from 25,000 years to the present and expanded that. It's also reversed. So this is the present zero, where sea level is today, what we've defined as zero. Back, say, 20,000 years ago when the last ice age ended, sea level was 400 feet lower. And as the climate started to warm, we melted a lot of ice. We raised the temperature of the oceans, which expanded the water. So over this roughly 10,000 year period, from 18,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago, sea level rose on average pretty rapidly, almost a half an inch a year, almost 4 feet per 100 years. But within that average, we now know there were some periods of very rapid rise. We think this now is due to ice sheet collapse in Antarctica that led to sea level changes as high as an inch a year, almost 8 feet per century. We could probably stand up there and almost watch that on a low sloping shoreline. And then about 8,000 years ago, it slowed almost to a halt, maybe rising a millimeter or less per year. And that happens to correspond to the entire period of human civilization. So throughout all those early civilizations until about 1900 or the end of the last century, the end of the 1800s, sea level was constant. So human civilization has never had to deal with sea level rise before. This is a new phenomena. This is the rate today based on satellite measurements, satellite altimetry, roughly 4.5 millimeters per year or 18 inches per century. But we know now that rate is accelerating as we add more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So this is the challenge we're going to face. We're facing already, and that may be, at least in my view, one of the biggest challenges human civilization has ever had to face, simply because we built most of the world's major cities on coast for some logical reasons, and most of the world's people live in coastal zones. I mean, it's obvious in California, but we are not alone. This is just an animation of going from that same time when the last ice age ended roughly 18,000 years ago to the present. It takes about, 15 seconds here. So this is the Northern California coast at San Francisco. This would be Santa Cruz, Sacramento. So we're going to see, as the ice melted, sea level began to rise. So it encroaches closer on the coastline. These are the Farallon Islands out here. Enters the Golden Gate about 8,000 years ago, goes all the way up to Sacramento. And then as sediment came in and we filled and so forth, we've changed the configuration of the shoreline. But what many people don't realize today is Sacramento is 100 miles from the Golden Gate, and it is at sea level. Both Sacramento and Stockton are ocean ports. So the coastal issues, I shouldn't say the sea level issues we face today are not restricted to the coastline, but all of these interior embayments, and in this case, 100 miles inland, are also affected by the rise in sea level. I don't want to show that twice. Come on here. Okay, I'm going to do a quick switch here. We have to be flexible. You may all recognize this as the Southern California coastline from Point Dume in Malibu, Santa Monica Bay, Palos Verdes Peninsula down to Long Beach, Newport, Balboa, and on down into Dana Point and so forth. So the yellow dashed line is the edge of the continental shelf, and that's where sea level was at the end of the last ice age. So again, as the ice melted, sea level rose roughly 400 feet and the shoreline retreated. So on average in the Long Beach area, it retreated about 10 miles or 3 feet per year over that interval. Not as much retreat down here because the shelf is narrower and we have, a different topography. We've measured sea level rise for the last 150 or so years using tide gauges, and there was one at Newport Beach. For some reason, it was turned off a number of years ago, but we have 12 of those along the California coast. We have one at Los Angeles. We have one in La Jolla, San Diego, and Santa Barbara, San Francisco. Tide gauges measure what's happening between the land and seawater or the ocean surface. But if the land is rising or sinking, it's going to give us the relative difference. So there's places in the world where the land is sinking. Think of Venice. Sea level is rising, or New Orleans is rising very, very fast relative to land. And there's places like Alaska where the land is rebounding from the ice cover in the past, and sea level is rising, but it's rising slower than the land is. So it's actually dropping relative to the shoreline. In 1993, we launched a series of satellites, and they are measuring sea level rise very, very precisely from space, down to 1/100 of a millimeter per year. And I don't need to say that we need to know very, very precisely exactly where these satellites are. And they're basically bouncing zillions of radar beams off of the ocean surface, averaging that out. This is the plot since they were launched in 1993 up until today, so 27 years. And what we can see is there's little variations in ocean temperatures and circulation and so forth, but over the period from 1993 to say 2010, that rate of rise averaged, we can do this either way, 3.23 millimeters per year or almost 13 inches per 100 years. But over the last 10 or 11 years, that rate is accelerated, and it's now roughly 19 inches per 100 years. So this is telling us something that's happening globally with sea level rising at an increasing rate. The driving force behind this and what could ultimately happen is the ice that's still sequestered on land. So if we look at all of the mountain glaciers, so the Alps, the Andes, the Himalayas, Alaska, and we melted all that ice, this happens to be Patagonia, we would raise sea level about 2 feet. Not really too big of a concern unless you happen to be within 2 feet of sea level. And there are about 250 million people around the planet that live within 3 feet of high tide. So 2 feet is a lot, even along the California coast. Greenland has the equivalent of about 24 feet of sea level rise. I don't know exactly where each of you are today, but I would guess many of you might be within 24 feet of high tide. And the big chunk of ice is in Antarctica. If we melted Antarctica, we would raise sea level about 190 feet. So together, roughly 216 feet of sea level rise contained in the ice. The point here is not that that's going to happen this year or next year or this century or next century, but that's the potential. And we don't need to raise it 216 feet to create problems. We're already creating challenges or problems today with very high tides and El Ninos and so forth. But this is the potential that's out there. And right now, no matter what we do, probably to at least 2050, we're not going to slow that down because of what greenhouse gases are already baked in the atmosphere. And that's a little frightening, a little concerning. Over the short term, however, because sea level rise is still going at a relatively slow rate, we have short-term events. King tides we're well aware of, El Ninos. This is the tide gauge record from Los Angeles, which is actually quite low compared to the global number. I think it's in part because this gauge is near LA Harbor. That area is actually slowly rising from tectonic forces, so it's sort of counteracting some of the sea level rise. But what we can see in this record is sort of these little blips in here. Those are El Nino years. Sea level can be 6, 8, 10 inches above normal for a week. So that's a lot of sea level rise over the short term. You may remember the winter of 1983, which is the biggest El Nino in probably half a century. And these are tide gauges along the West Coast, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle. These were the predicted high tides. These were what were actually recorded because of that El Nino, which is a warm bulge of water moving north from the equator. And these are the differences. So in LA, we had sea level, which was the highest recorded in 59 years, about a foot above normal. And you can see even higher in San Francisco, the entire period of their tide gauge goes back to the 1850s, the highest it had ever been recorded. So these are short-term events that are going to affect us. So there's two environments in particular where sea level rise is going to affect us. One are low-lying areas where we're going to see short-term flooding followed by permanent inundation. This happens to be Capitola, a few miles from where I am during a nice sunny summer day with a wide beach and a low seawall here, people enjoying it. This is during a high tide in El Nino year where water covered the beach, went over the seawall and into downtown Capitola. And that has happened on more than a few occasions. North of San Francisco, this is the off-ramp going into Marin. This is not actually river flooding, but it's high tide a few years ago. This is just north of Ventura, and I've never really been able to figure out this picture. I think it's real. I don't know whether she is aware that the water's rising and she's letting it in so it doesn't break her windows or exactly what's happening, but it's an example of another area. Huntington Beach, again, this is high tide. The Balboa Peninsula, high tide today without any additional sea level rise. And then within the bay, there's been a number of king tide photos taken now at these extreme tides we get a couple times a year. This is a low tide and this is high tide. So there's a number of homes that are within, a foot or so of high tide today. The other kind of process we need to be concerned about, or we are concerned about, in addition to low-lying areas, are areas of bluffs or cliffs where homes, apartments, condominiums have been built on the cliff edge. These actually were built back a couple of 100 feet back in the 60s, but this is not rock, but it's pretty weak material that's been eroding. These are now all gone, but as sea level rises, depending on what makes up the cliffs or the bluffs, waves will attack the cliff more frequently and coastal erosion will be accelerated. Place you may know, Isla Vista at UC Santa Barbara, a rapidly eroding stretch of cliffs. This is all student housing. This was taken in the early 2000s, 2003 or 4, and you can see these apartments on the edge. Some of these are already sort of cantilevered over the edge. You can see these decks and so forth. And this is a couple of years later. They were red tagged. Part of this unit's been removed. Part of these units have been removed. These decks are gone. So Santa Barbara is struggling with these issues as well. Fortunately, for much of Southern California, until you get to San Diego County and Encinitas and Leucadia and Solana Beach, at least in Orange County, most of the development is built on more resistant rock cliffs. And as we get further south, we're into places where the beaches are wider, at least temporarily. They're a little higher, the homes, and there's a railroad track between the homes and the shoreline. So cliff erosion isn't an immediate issue yet. It is in Del Mar, further south, and you've probably been reading about the problem with Amtrak and erosion of the bluff at the edge of the track. So here's an area where there's going to have to be some decisions made in the near future about what will be done. The state of California has been trying to deal with what to expect with sea level rise for a while now. This was a committee that was set up that did this report by Jerry Brown in 2017, which looked to the future. This report is online. And then the Ocean Protection Council the next year actually converted those numbers that we determined. I chaired the committee that did this report, put these into sort of guidance, probability estimates, how to begin to plan for this. And essentially where the biggest concerns rise today from are Antarctica. Greenland's melting also, and those are two quite different land masses. But in Antarctica, what's happening is, again, there's roughly 190 feet of sea level rise. Equivalent is there's these massive glaciers. They are held in place by these floating ice shelves. And I'm going to liken this sort of to the cork in a champagne bottle. It's holding back these massive ice shelves. This is what we think probably broke loose at the end of the last ice age. But what's happening as the air is warming, it's starting to melt these shells from the top and creating these melt ponds. The water is warming and getting underneath these shelves and starting to break them loose from below. So we've seen some pretty big chunks of ice break off. Cliffs can only stand so high. So the question is, when we get to a breaking point or a trigger point where these melt and then these glaciers start to advance. And that's a complicated problem that people are working on. It's not going to happen overnight, but it can happen over the course of months. What came out of those two studies? Normally I would never show a table like this with a lot of numbers, and it's what cities and counties are dealing with today. It's what Coastal Commission is working with. And essentially, this is looking into the future at the year 2030, 2040, 2050, off to 2100. These are potential future sea level rise or projected depending on high emissions or low or high emissions, depending on which way we go with greenhouse gases. And it doesn't really matter much until 2050, and then it starts to make a difference. Right now, we're on the high emission trajectory. We're still emitting large amounts of carbon dioxide every year. And these numbers are predicted or projected sea level rises. This is for the Los Angeles tide gauge area. And these are sort of probabilities to keep in mind, so that if, let's just say we're thinking about 2050, we're going to build something today that's going to last 30 years. The midpoint of the probability is 0.7 feet, or say, 8 or 9 inches. That means there's a 50% chance it could be higher than this, a 50% chance it could be lower. Then there's the likely range, where there's a 2/3 probability being between these two numbers. So for 2050, it could be 6 inches, it could be a foot. There's a 5% probability that it could be higher. There's a 0.5% probability that it could be higher. And then there is something that's been called H++, which is, as the people who run these climate models, sea level models will describe it, this is theoretically possible, but we don't know what the probability is. So depending on what year you're looking at, how long your facility infrastructure may last, and what risk you're willing to take. And if you're going to build a big, I'll use something that may or may not be popular, but it doesn't matter. It's just an example. a big desal plant, a $1 billion desal plant, a sewage treatment plant, an airport. You don't want to build something that's going to cost $1 billion and underestimate it. So you're probably going to be over here someplace. If you're going to build a bike path or a parking lot, you can probably afford to take a little more risk, but you can start to get an idea here, depending on how far out into the future you go, what kinds of numbers that you need to begin to think about. And this is where the Coastal Commission is also coming from. So just to use a couple local examples, Balboa Island, as best I can tell from what's online, it has about $4 billion in assessed home value. And we know now during very high tides, even in the summer, that waves are coming over the Balboa Peninsula into the parking lots, for example. And we know that there's now, this is before the 9 inches was added to this wall, that during very high tides, water comes over the seawall around Balboa into the streets and so forth. So there are 2 sites now that are very useful for looking at what might happen in the future. One is called Surging Seas, that is put out by Climate Central, and there's an identical site put out by NOAA called Sea Level Rise Viewer. And what they've done, you can do this for any place in the nation. Click on to a location. It basically uses the most precise elevations we have for the land, and it uses what we would simply call a bathtub model. So this is today high tide, Balboa Island, the peninsula, so forth. So you can incrementally go up in 1 foot increments. So this is adding 1 foot above highest tides today, what would be covered with seawater. So this would come over that seawall, and you can see which parts, for example, of Balboa Island would be covered, and you can start to see the edge of the peninsula. This is just purely using elevation and 1 foot of sea level rise, which could happen by 2030, 2040. I'm just going to jump this up to 3 feet. We could do 2 feet, but at 3 feet, essentially all of Balboa Island is below sea level, and much of the peninsula. So this just gives us a sense of what's out there. And again, you could do this for San Diego or Santa Monica or San Francisco and see what's very close to sea level. What this doesn't add in is any storm surge, wave run up that might happen along the shoreline. This is just what we call the bathtub model. And this is another map doing it, a similar elevation, but marking in red, again, what would be covered by 3 feet of sea level rise. And again, just coming back to that table, you can see, when do we get to 3 feet? Well, it could be 2070, could be a little bit before that, but it's not tomorrow, it's not in the next 20 or 30 years. But again, we have the short-term events of very high tides and El Ninos to think about. Some of you may have seen this. Prepare for 10 feet of sea level rise. Coastal Commission tells coastal cities. That's the tough one. If you put 10 feet along the coast of California, you lose a lot. Infrastructure, property, real estate, and so forth. So whether this is realistic or not, I mean, that's an extreme possible by 2100, but not any time in the near future. So what's next? What are the options for the future? There really aren't a whole lot, and you could probably all name these. One I'll just call is denial or wait and see. Unfortunately, we do not get to vote on sea level rise. It's happening. We're still trying to be more precise on the exact future rate of rise. We can nourish the beaches, put more sand on beaches. What we've done historically is built armor, seawalls, revetments. The words that no coastal property owner wants to hear, but we're hearing from the Coastal Commission and others, is relocation, whatever we call that. Planned retreat, unplanned retreat, stepping back gracefully. So the East Coast has a lot of examples, particularly with hurricanes, of waiting and seeing. And each time a hurricane hits, we see what's been destroyed. Fortunately, we don't have hurricanes. We do have very high tides and El Ninos. Beach nourishment has been a way of life on the Atlantic coast. We've spent over $5 billion, hundreds and hundreds of nourishment projects, not so much in California. The main ones that have been done have been by San Diego. These are projects that are done specifically with nourishment in mind, not dredging out a harbor entrance of a river channel. So they did 2 nourishments, one in 2001, 2012. They added 3.5 million cubic yards of sand that they collected from offshore and put it on about 12 beaches. Cost $46 million, and each of those was gone in 1 to 2 years. It does not stay. Where there was no beach there naturally, why should we expect it to stay? Because we pumped it out of a dredge. So nourishment is a very expensive short-term solution. Armor is, again, what we've depended on for decades. For the entire coast of California, which includes a lot of coast that is rural, Northern California particularly, 14% has been armored. But if you look at the 4 Southern California counties, San Diego, Orange, LA, and Ventura, 38% of that entire coast has been armored. I'm just showing you a few examples. This is Monterey Bay, but Broad Beach in Malibu, Capistrano, Encinitas. So the types of structures vary widely, how well they protect, how long they last, what they cost. But the important point here that I think most coastal communities now, certainly the city and county planning departments, are aware of, the original Coastal Act basically had some language in it that was a little unclear about protection. And one of the sentences in there said existing structures can be protected or considered for protection. Primary structures, if they are threatened and they mitigate for sand losses. When it said existing structures, in the subsequent half a century since the Coastal Commission was set up, many new structures have been built, and people have come in who needed protection and said, well, my structure exists now, I want a seawall. What the Coastal Commission has done in the last year or so is said, well, we're going to go back to the original Coastal Act and said, what we meant was a structure existing at the time the Coastal Act was built. So everything I see and hear from the Coastal Commission, and I do a fair amount of coastal consulting, is unless you have a pre-Coastal Act structure or you're repairing an existing armor, seawall, revetment, it's going to be very, very difficult to get any future armor built along the California coast. So I'll just leave that there for now. Managed retreat is something that's new words that not many people really want to talk about. There's not very many examples yet. We moved the Cape Hatteras light back 2,000 feet at a cost of $12 million. We've moved some pretty big structures back from the coast, but there's a lot more on the edge. In Ventura, they actually did a planned retreat, but this was pretty easy. It was a parking lot and a bike path. They're now going to have to move it back again and relocate it. There is one section of Highway 1 up at Piedras Blancas and San Simeon where the road was right on the edge. They actually spent a number of years getting approval. They've moved that inland, so we could call this managed retreat. And I was just on a phone call this morning with a reporter, and the Coastal Commission unanimously approved rerouting Highway 1 along the Sonoma coast, where a whole series of homes have fallen into the water. And they're going to actually cross this creek and move the highway inland with a bridge and so forth. So this is now, before it's done, is probably going to take 15 years, but this is another one of the few examples of managed retreat along the California coast. This concept is what the Coastal Commission is asking each city and county to include in their updated local coastal programs. And you're probably well aware that some cities, 3 in particular, Pacifica, Imperial Beach, and Del Mar, said, no, we are not going to include managed retreat in our long range plans. Pacific, interestingly, these were apartments. They're all gone. They've been demolished. Imperial Beach down near San Diego, or the southernmost part of the state, already experiences high tide flooding. Del Mar is just a lot of homeowners on the sand who do not want to entertain that idea. So there's some challenges ahead working with the Coastal Commission. And I think personally that they haven't done in the past a great job at communicating. And I think what we need to do is at least begin to accept the fact that there will come a day in the future where sea level is going to be 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, 10 feet higher, and we have to have a plan. What are we going to do at that point? Not that we do it today or tomorrow or somebody condemns your house, but this is going to be a tough one. On the East Coast, they're experiencing these problems much more regularly, and they have hurricanes, but one of the big factors there, maybe more than science, is economics. And what's beginning to happen because of the amount of property losses is the insurance companies are no longer willing to insure properties, which means the mortgage companies are no longer willing to give them mortgages. So there's been the beginnings of decline in property values. I'm not aware that this has happened in California yet, but there's significant losses over time. So just to kind of close this off, it's interesting how many books have been written recently about rising water levels, rising sea levels, what's coming next. And then every once in a while we get one by an organization which is sort of a anti-climate change sea level rise that looks at it another way. And then I'm just going to share 2 books that I have written or co-authored recently. One is looking at the issues we face along coastlines today. One is sort of the California coast and what kind of issues we face. And then another book that has been around for some time on looking sort of mile by mile at the California coast and what does it mean to live with a coastline that's eroding and changing, and what are our options and so forth. So I'm going to stop there and happy to answer any questions. I know that's not good news, but as a scientist, I just tried to tell you what we see, what we see coming.
We appreciate that. My head is spinning a little bit with information that I never thought so hard about, but that was great information. I know we had a number of people that were monitoring questions. Was there anything that is a specific question or something that wasn't addressed there that we want to put forth?
I don't see anything at this time, Rob.
Okay, that was an incredibly thorough presentation. So some of it only went back 8,500 years. That was interesting to see the stats and the graphs and really the trends and where things have gone and are going. So we very much appreciate it. We'd love for you to stay on if anything else comes up question-wise. But on that note, I think we want to turn it over to Don Schmitz then, and with Smart Coast California, and continue on with our presentation. It's all yours, Don.
Thank you. Could we get the PowerPoint presentation pulled up, please? So Kimberly, am I just going to ask you to move this forward as necessary? Okay, great. So for everybody, again, my name is Don Schmitz. I am a land use consultant. I've specialized in the coastal zone. I've been working in the coastal zone for some 35 years. I used to work for the California Coastal Commission. Enjoyed Gary's presentation. I've seen it before. I've worked with Gary on solutions in the past, and he's highly esteemed. I just wish that one of these days I could be introduced as a highly esteemed panelist. But there's a lot that goes into it. You heard some of the science, and my background in geography is in understanding on a macro scale sort of geographic principles that Dr. Griggs was putting forward. But there's also a lot of political considerations, economic considerations. Look, the reality is that well over 70% of the coastline when it comes to sea level rise, we really don't care all that much. Or if we care, we just know that nature's going to go in whatever direction she goes, because there's no development there. Where it really becomes highly controversial and a very important factor for our lawmakers and for our decision makers in different communities is those areas along our coastline that we have these communities, this critical infrastructure, things of that nature. Now, the Coastal Commission has been hugely involved and out in the forefront in doing the land use planning to address sea level rise. Next slide, please. And one of the main focuses that they've been doing is over the last 5 or so years, they have been giving grants to folks to update their LCPs. Now, the thing that the Coastal Commission is most fond of, and apparently my slides are in a different order than was printed out for me, but the thing that the Coastal Commission is, okay, there we go. I can roll with it. Not the first time I've had to roll with the punches here, Kim. Don't worry about it. So Gary touched base on this briefly, which is managed retreat. Okay, well, what's managed retreat? We all know what retreat is, which is run. Okay, you're about to get overrun. So what's managed retreat? Well, you do it in a more manageable fashion. And what that means is you build backwards. And as you do good land use planning, you pull development back when it's getting replaced, not just critical infrastructure like roads and desal plants and sewage treatment plants, but residential neighborhoods and railroads and all these things that we're dealing with. And so here's a picture of managed retreat, and it's really it's kind of warm and fuzzy. You know, when you take a look at this picture, you've got an area back behind the intertidal zone where you got this open parkland area, and you just sort of let nature erode back as the sea levels rise. And in places like that, we're not going to have any problems whatsoever. But go to the next slide, please. The problem that we have is that in many places along coastal zone of California, we have homes, businesses, critical infrastructure. Gary showed a couple of really excellent pictures. And we have some folks who are movers and shakers in land use planning. They're representing various communities down here in Southern California that are grappling with this issue of how do you retreat when you've got no place to retreat to? And one of the things that we need to do in these vulnerability assessments, these risk assessments that the cities have been doing up and down the state in conjunction with the Coastal Commission, is how great is the risk? It's not necessarily as dire as taking a look at things going back to the last ice age, where you had hundreds of feet of sea level rise. In fact, if you looked at Dr. Griggs' table, the 5 foot of sea level rise by the end of the century was about a 5% chance, which means it's about a 95% chance that there's not going to be 5 foot of sea level rise. But the Coastal Commission is requiring these different communities to utilize at a minimum 5 foot of sea level rise for incorporation into their local coastal program updates. And they're going to require the local cities and counties to adopt regulations that all future development must accommodate at least that 5 foot of sea level rise. And in some places, that's going to be something that we can do. In other places, it's going to be extremely difficult for those local communities. Next slide, please. Now, this raises some pretty difficult issues for these local cities and counties, not the least of which is the taking of private property. And boy, our slides are completely out of order here. Kim, can we go to the next slide and see if it's in there? All right, here we go. So a couple very important things. The Fifth Amendment of the Federal Constitution says private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. Most folks understand that. What a lot of people are less familiar with is the California Coastal Commission, Article 1, Section 1, which says a number of things, including that it is an inalienable right to possess and protect your private property. And then the Coastal Act itself in Section 30010 says that the Coastal Commission and the local cities shall not exercise their power to grant or deny a permit in a manner which will take or damage private property for public use, such as maintaining the beaches, without the payment of just compensation therefor. So what does that mean? It means that these cities and counties are put in this very, very difficult position that should they adopt regulations which do not allow existing homes in commercial projects and things of that nature to protect their property, that means if it's going to be allowed to wash into the sea, that's a taking, or it's most likely going to be considered a taking. And that means that the city or the county is going to be on the hook for buying out those properties should they be precluded from having shoreline protection devices. And that's why a lot of these communities, including some of the movers and shakers which are sitting on this panel today representing counties and cities, have been taking very strong positions that they're not going to amend their LCP, for instance, to redefine existing development as existing before 1977. Because that's not what the Coastal Act says. And in fact, the legislature, there was moves to amend the Coastal Act not once but twice to redefine existing development as being before 1977. It failed both times. So we know that existing development means just that. It is existing development. And so these very pointed conversations that San Clemente has had, that Del Mar has had, that a number of other different cities and counties are currently having with the Coastal Commission. This is the tension that's going on right now, and we're trying to work out. In fact, just last week, the California Coastal Commission adopted a strategic plan, and they also adopted a position paper with the League of Cities and the Coalition of Coastal Counties in regards to having a joint approach in regards to sea level rise and how they're going to deal with this going forward. But what we do know is that a lot of folks in Sacramento are even starting to take note of this issue in regards to the takings. There was a bill that was contemplated just this year. Of course, the pandemic blew up all sorts of things, to amend the I-Bank so that the state could start bringing in robust dollars to condemn private property if they were not going to allow the private property owners to protect their existing structures and allow it to fall into the sea. Next slide, Kim. Let's see what we got. It's like a big surprise, a little bit like Christmas here. Okay, so as already discussed, the government simply cannot require property owners to allow natural hazards to destroy their property for public benefit without just compensation. Next slide. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we could contemplate doing here, because we want to come up with solutions. Oh, by the way, there's a number of things that we need to talk about. First of all, some folks still want to debate sea level rise. Actually, what they want to debate is whether or not it's anthropogenic sea level rise caused by human activities, part of a natural cycle. For everybody on this panel and that's watching this today, it really is beside the point. First of all, the scientists do seem to have a very broad consensus in regards to a warming planet and rising seas. But second of all, it's the law. Sacramento has passed legislation and numerous bills, and we need to find ourselves moving in the direction of compliance with this. The governor has the Coastal Commission talking to some dozen different state agencies, from Caltrans to the State Lands Commission to what have you, to implement statewide responses to sea level rise. And in fact, they're requiring critical infrastructure to accommodate 10 feet of sea level rise, because critical infrastructure has a lifespan that's expected to be well over a century, whereas a house typically 75 to 80 years, right? But what exactly are we going to do in those areas whereupon there's no place to retreat and communities are confronted literally with ceasing to exist? Gary showed us pictures of Balboa Island. Well, I'm pretty confident that Balboa Island and the city of Newport Beach are not going to sit idly by and watch their city go underwater. and they're not going to adopt a local coastal program where they're going to watch entire portions of their community simply disappear into the ocean. And you know that humanity has, if you take a look at the Dutch and the Netherlands, for instance, with much less robust technology, has managed to accommodate and manage the shoreline so that people can live there. Now, the Coastal Commission, by the way, and this is for a lot of the professionals monitoring this presentation, as well as folks with in the real estate community, the Coastal Commission and the lawmakers in Sacramento have acknowledged and understand that there's certain places where managed retreat simply is not going to happen. It's not. The Port of Long Beach in Los Angeles, which is worth billions of dollars, isn't going to be picked up and moved further inland because there's sea level rise. It is a foregone conclusion that places like that, we're going to build taller seawalls, we're going to elevate the pier areas, we're going to protect this critical infrastructure areas. And of course, in the very rural, undeveloped sections of the coastline, which is most of the coastline in California, Mother Nature is going to be allowed to do her thing as well. And if you've got an occasional house or a section of like Pacific Highway 1 up in Central California, it's already been relocated inland, that's going to not be a problem. This conversation is going to come down to literally those residential areas by and large, these coastal communities, and whether or not they're going to be required to be given up to the sea. And that is going to be, I think, really over the next 10 years, the critical debate. And that's where Smart Coast California is coming in, because we want to be part of not only helping to pass information out to folks up and down the coast and assisting the cities and the counties, but also see if we can find solutions. Now, I've had conversations with Dr. Griggs in regards to beach nourishment programs in the past, and I completely agree with him that when you have an eroding beach, the science says if you dump sand on it and do a beach nourishment project, it washes away. I mean, there's been examples of 300,000 cubic yards of sand being put on a beach and getting washed away in one storm. But one of the things that we have seen in other parts of the world and in the East Coast is where they build artificial reefs. And some of the cities and some of the counties have been beginning to incorporate studies and options for neighborhoods and communities to incorporate that community getting together to develop an artificial reef for, it's called sediment management, to retain the beaches, to break the backs of the waves. There's a couple examples here. This is Narrowneck, an artificial reef down the Gold Coast in Australia. And you can see a picture in 1996 taken at high tide, and then 2001, 5 years later, and you can see it turns it from an eroding beach into an accreting beach. And you can also see in this picture that in the 1996 shot up and down the coastline, you can see traditionally they're building a rock revetment here to keep the storm waves from continuing to erode away the shoreline, taking out the parking lot and high rises and things in that nature. In 2001, you can see because they built the reef off in the surf zone, the beach is accreting. It's now buried that revetment, and the beach is growing. And one of the things that the realtors are very, very dialed into is they love the environment and they love the beaches. And in fact, that's what makes these coastal communities so valuable. So Smart Coast California has been very, very involved also in regards to the protection of the environment and the protection of the beaches. Next slide, please. So this is Gran Dominicus, sand retention reef. 1999 and 2001, these are these reef balls, which are these like concrete beehive structures, which are placed off the shore. They are in California already. They're used for habitat enhancement because they'll produce several hundred pounds of biomass per year just by sitting out there, in addition to breaking the back of the waves so the beach doesn't erode. And I'd also point out, one of the things that I really appreciate in the looking at the macro timescales that Gary was showing you is the sea level rise and fall is very natural. And it's been happening for millennia. And the coral reefs that we have on the islands down in the South Pacific have been there for hundreds of thousands of years. And the ocean levels back when all of North America, at least the Canadian part in North Asia, was covered under 2 miles of ice, the sea levels were 400 feet lower. And when the sea levels rose pretty aggressively, the coral reefs, the natural coral reefs, built themselves up to continue to protect the shorelines and create these lagoons around the islands. They followed the rise of the seas. And one of the big confrontations that's happening between the local planners and the state planners in regards to these long-term local coastal program amendments is, what do we do? Because I don't think anybody wants to armor the entire coastline of California, but we cannot just pretend that our communities aren't there anymore. Laguna Beach is there, San Diego's there, the list goes on and on and on, right? Malibu is there, North County, Ventura. These reef options, perhaps in conjunction with beach nourishment projects, would allow us to maintain the beaches and protect our communities which are along the shoreline without having the just horrible, horrible confrontation of telling individual property owners and in fact entire sections of communities that they just need to walk away and allow their town to wash into the ocean. Next slide, please. So this is another picture of those reef balls that I was just describing to you. And some of these pictures are taken here off the California. Next slide, please. Next slide. And that's, I guess, the end of it. I also had sent down, but it got lost in the shuffle somehow, a tabulation of all the different LCP amendments which are under process right now. Some of them are very imminent. Some have already been before the California Coastal Commission and recently pulled back. And then there's some which are in the queue, and folks are trying to learn from the experience of other cities and counties. And one of those that's coming down the pike right now is Half Moon Bay, and they're processing their local coastal program amendment. They were flirting around with that 1977 definition for existing development. They've taken that out. The manager treat policy is being replaced by a property protection plan, which promotes individual neighborhoods working with public agencies in the city to create more neighborhood-wide or section of coastline solutions, as opposed to just having a hodgepodge of individual revetments and seawalls to protect individual structures, which has not resulted in a scenario which we really want to see. This is something which has also been reflected in what was adopted by Santa Cruz, where they have certain neighborhoods where they're saying, and they've embraced manager treat in many parts of Santa Cruz, but they're saying, look, we've got these particular neighborhoods and we're just not willing, California Coastal Commission, to tell these people that this part of our community is dispensable, that it's something that we're willing to sacrifice and allow to be taken into the sea. So in closing, Smart Coast California is here as an asset to assist the local cities and counties and the local real estate organizations and GADs. We're constructively engaged with the coastal commissioners. I am personally involved with that as well with these other things. There's going to be a lot of heat and light in conversations and debate. This is probably one of the 2 or 3 biggest on a dollar scale anyways, land use issues that is confronting the state of California. But we do think that ultimately, if there is a lot of good coordinated work that goes into it, that we can find solutions that do not result in billions of dollars of takings, but also protect our precious beaches and environment.
Thank you, Don, for that information. That was very helpful to hear. And I know that a few questions popped into our panel, into our Q&A window here. If Bobby or Kim or Dave, if you guys want to address any of those questions you think maybe pointed towards either Don or Dr. Griggs.
Sure, I have one. This is Bobby. I have one from Jesse Brosa for Don Schmidt. When cities are writing or rewriting their LCP, is the California Coastal Commission allowed phased levels of SLR estimates to be incorporated into building codes or required the 5-foot to 100-year SLR estimates to be incorporated immediately?
That's an excellent question. SLR, sea level rise. We have to abbreviate everything in this business. All the land use planners on this panel understand that. So it's CEQA, it's EIR, it's SLR. Otherwise, we could never complete a sentence. So yes, increasingly flexibility in regards to the timing of these, which is not to be misconstrued as in that category of wait and see, the denial. No, not at all. But what we do know is that the science is a little bit still open for debate in regards to how fast it will happen. We have our statistical probabilities, and the worst, pretty much the worst case scenario is 5 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century, or at least there's a 5% chance of that. There's always a worst case scenario. So that is being pointed out to the Coastal Commission by a number of different counties and cities. And they're trying to incorporate a phased approach. Now, the difficulty with this, with the Coastal Commission and other organizations who feel passionately, there's a lot of NGOs and such as the Surf Riders and Sierra Club and the others who just want managed retreat. I mean, that's it. They don't like even the smell of a rock revetment to be anywhere on the coast of California. And they've got good reasons why they don't want to see that. But the direction that this is going is the Coastal Commission is concerned that if they allow a house to be built or rebuilt, and there's that old 50% remodel rule, and it can turn an older house into a new house that needs to comply, the lifespan of that house is typically 70 or 80 years towards the end of the century. And so the Coastal Commission is going to want it to at least be designed so that if at all humanly possible, it will never need a shoreline protection device for the lifespan of that particular project, which is going through the permit process. Okay. And what the Coastal Commission started to do 15 or so years ago is they started to put deed restrictions on people's homes when they came in for a coastal development permit. Said, irrespective of what the Coastal Act says, you can never ask for a shoreline protection device. Okay. Now the cities are going to be getting on the hook to do that, but it is definitely heading in the direction of having a phased approach whereupon should certain levels of sea level rise manifest, then different regulations and policies will kick into place. That is the direction we're going, and that's an excellent question.
Thank you. I do have another question that came in for Dr. Griggs. That you mentioned property insurance. Are there any resources you can recommend to get better data there?
Yeah, the study I listed there, and they've done a lot of work, is out of New York City, and it's called the First Street Foundation. And they've done a number of reports. They have a website, and you can actually pull out any of the reports. They seem to be updating these fairly commonly. So they're doing it by state, they're doing it by region, telling you exactly what's happening in each state, how property values have declined and so forth. So that's the best recommendation I can make. And I'm not aware, again, in California, anybody that's looked at it. My sense is property values on the coast are still going up.
Thank you.
Any other questions we see in there that we need to address before we move on to our?
I have another one for Don Schmidt. Can you touch on again the work SCCA is doing with regards to gathering precedent, settings, infractions, for example, final negotiations, LCP language between coastal cities and Coastal Commission to the advantage of coastal cities en masse?
En masse.
En masse, thank you.
Yes. So if I can read that again, Don, can you
Thank
touch
you.
on, again, the work SCCA is doing with regard to gathering precedent-setting interactions, i.e. the final negotiated LCP language between coastal cities and the Coastal Commission to the advantage of coastal cities en masse? Yes, in fact, one of the things that our board recently tasked my firm with is to start to compile list of just those sorts of things which seem to be working. And in fact, a couple coastal commissioners have had a number of meetings with me and with our president of the board of SCC, and doing outreach. They are trying to constructively engage. And one of the things that they asked us to do is, hey, what works? It's easy to criticize, but trot it out. What works? And so we are working on that as we speak. But I have to tell you that to date, a couple of the most recent ones, especially down in Southern California, have not been exactly resounding successes. There's going to be, well, let me back up for a minute. What do I mean by not resounding successes? The local jurisdiction did not leave happy. Okay, and perhaps for some of you, it would be beneficial if I spend just a quick second explaining how the process works. A local coastal program vests in the city or county the legal authority to issue their own coastal development permits. To adopt an LCP or to amend it, the local city council or board of supervisors has to have their professional staff draft the report for the amendment. The community gets to testify on that. It gets adopted by the board of the city council. It gets sent up to the coastal commission. Then the coastal commission staff chews on it for a little bit. They negotiate with their counterparts at the city or county. They bring it to the commission with what are called suggested modifications. Then the coastal commission, you got 12 very big personalities there, and they're all talking about what they think ought to happen. They're seeking compromises. They adopt certain suggested modifications, and they don't adopt certain modifications. And then they send it back to the local city council or board of supervisors for adoption. And if that council or that board is not in agreement, they can just say, nope, we're not doing it. We're walking away. And what's also confronting the cities and the counties is if they don't update their local coastal programs to address sea level rise, when they continue to approve people's beach houses, remodels, the redoing of their commercial projects, all those projects, by their nature where they are on the shoreline, are appealable to the coastal commission. And so the coastal commission could just start appealing these projects up. We've got a very tough couple years of negotiations on this, but to you, Kim, what I think I'd be very happy to do, and of course we're planning on doing this anyways, is when we pull some of these together in regards to what we think are viable options, and we do think the offshore reefs being done by neighborhoods and communities, and yes, we think that there's certain communities such as in Newport Beach, Balboa Island, and other places, Lido Island, where they are going to have to increase the size of the bulkheads, things of that nature. We're going to compile that into a position paper, and we're going to make sure we distribute that to everybody.
Great, thank you. That would be the perfect segue, but I think we've got a few other questions. Do we want to address those, or do we want to save those more towards the tail end here?
Yeah, I think we should circle back to the questions after we hear from some of the cities, because they might get answered through that.
Perfect. Then why don't we start with Simone Georges with the city of Newport Beach. We would love to start with you.
Well, thank you, everybody, and hello. I'm Simone Georges. I'm the community development director for the city of Newport Beach. I don't have a PowerPoint for all of you, but I think what you've heard from Dr. Griggs and Don Schmitz, it's very important. I think one thing to keep in mind, and it was touched upon by both Don and Gary, is the cost to modify or prepare for the sea level rise. I mean, it's an important aspect for the city of Newport Beach. There's a lot in the city that is controlled by private property owners. For example, there's a lot of the bulkheads, those seawalls in the city of Newport Beach, those are not all owned by the city. Balboa Island's bulkhead is owned by the city, but a lot of the rest of the bulkheads are really controlled by private property owners. We've done a really good job with Balboa Island. We've, as Gary talked about, we put a cap on top of that bulkhead, and that's going to last us a few years few decades, hopefully, and we'll add to it more. Those seawalls are aged out. They do need to get replaced, and the cost of replacement is really, really high. So, finding the funds to replace those bulkheads around Balboa Island is going to be really difficult. For the remainder of the city of Newport Beach, we have a lot of properties on the harbor side. And what we've been doing is each time a property, and we see this a lot, a property is actually scraped, somebody buys a single family home and demolishes it. We ask that they do a study of their existing bulkhead and that they raise the bulkhead up. If the bulkhead is, and when I say bulkhead, those are the seawalls, if those bulkheads are structurally stable, that could last another 50 odd years, we go ahead and let them raise that. We'll require them to actually raise that bulkhead height up to 11 or more feet. And each of the existing bulkheads are, vary in size and vary in age. And if they need to replace that bulkhead because the structural stability of it, then that future bulkhead will have to be engineered for 3 to 4 feet even higher than where it is at now. So, we are slowly preparing and slowly trying to get ahead of it. A lot of what we're doing is that armoring of the properties, as Don mentioned. That's really where our focus is. The other focus is going to be on our height of the finished floor elevations of these properties. One thing that we do need that we're optimistic about is time. That sea level rise isn't going to accelerate within the next 10 years. If it does, then there's no way that we can get ahead of it. There's no way for us to catch up or to beat it. If the sea levels are going to be rising up to 3-4 feet in the next 20 years, that's really difficult for us. But if it's going to rise 3-4 feet in the next 100 years, that's something that we can slowly prepare for, slowly get ahead of. Everything costs money. It costs money to modify the bulkheads. It costs money to raise the height of the existing dwelling units. Everything costs money. So, definitely need to spend the money to get prepared for this. But we can't do it in 1 decade. That is just too fast, too soon for us. A lot of property values in Newport Beach, they're going in the many, many millions of dollars. So we definitely want to protect these assets. It is very important for the city and very important for the property owners. Not only do we have private property, we do have public property. We have our fire stations, we have our roads, we have our signals, we have a lot of underground utilities. All that has to get protected. All that the city has to spend money on as we move forward. So it is kind of a slow walk, unfortunately, for our utilities. We are seeing and Gary had some of those photos where you see some of our parking lots getting flooded, and you get that storm surge from storms out on the coast. FEMA came in and did a large mapping exercise of the entire western coastline and have mapped some of our city into actually flood zones. So now these properties have to pay for insurance. Very expensive. Flood insurance is very expensive for a number of these properties. We are going to look at the sand replenishment. What can we do with the topography of our beaches? That is actually very important. We can at least slow down those storm surges as they come forward. But as you saw through some of those animation, if you're going to see the tides or the sea level rise go up 10 feet, there's only so much you can do with changing the topography of our beaches or our sand. So, we take sea level rise very seriously in the city of Newport Beach. The council takes it very seriously. Again, we're looking to protect not only private property assets, but we're also looking to protect, the public's assets and the public's money with regard to their infrastructure too. So I'm just touching upon just a little bit of, kind of what we do in Newport Beach, and just happy to answer any questions about the city of Newport.
All right, thank you, Simone. Very much appreciate that. Are there any questions, Kimberly, that or Bobby, that you're seeing in the window?
I do have one that talks about what about bridges need to raise for boating?
Very good point. I think that's a really important subject. With rising tides, we are seeing some of our bridges be impacted already, especially when we have those king tides. I don't think we're there yet as far as raising the height of bridges. Fortunately, tides, ebb, they ebb, they rise and fall. So there are low tide moments. So we haven't had a need yet to raise the bridges. But I do think that it's something that we're going to have to address probably in the next 10 years.
Thank you.
And maybe we could push this question also Simone's way, or to Dr. Griggs or Don, regarding, there was one question about the Huntington Beach, about the river channel. And I think some of that may have been addressed with the reworking of that. I think that was about 20 years back. Simone, I don't know if you have any history on that, but I think that definitely changed some of the way that the flood maps were put together when they did the heightening of the flood control channel at the end of the Santa Ana River.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the question specifically.
It was specific to Huntington Beach, but I figured since it's adjacent and sort of a shared solve there that was done back. I can't remember how long ago it was, because I do live in Huntington Beach, so I know that right in that specific area that they are referencing there. So,
well, I do know that we did. There's a lot of silt that comes down through that river mouth, and that silt builds up over time. We've, on the city of Newport Beach side, we've taken that silt and kind of replenished some of our beaches. Our beaches are affected by just the coastal activity. It's less so about storm surge, but we have some of that sand is getting removed over time just because of the way the kind of those waves hit the coastline and the water and the surf line there. So we've done some replenishment projects from that river mouth. And I see Ricky is here from Huntington Beach. Maybe he can help kind of answer some of that questions.
Yeah, so I don't have any specific information regarding the Santa Ana River, but there is beach nourishment through the coast of Huntington Beach from Sunset Beach down. And I know it's a regional effort. The one thing I know about the Santa Ana River is when that was completed, that hundreds of homes were taken out of the flood zone, but there's ongoing efforts to constantly study the different channels, and there have been instances where homes that were taken out of the flood zone have had to come back in. So it's an ongoing challenge.
all right, I appreciate that from both of you. Thank you.
Simone, we have a question. Is there still a discussion about creating a Newport Harbor entrance barrier for extreme high tides?
That's an interesting question. That was discussed probably, I want to say it was less than 10 years ago. It's not off the table. I think, we've been focused on other areas, but I think it's something that we still need to circle back with. No one's really talking about it. There hasn't been any meetings with regards to that barrier. I think what you're seeing, right now, the city's focused on the state's housing crisis. Here you are, you have sea level rise, and you have this on one side, you have the Coastal Commission mandating that, cities focus all their attention on sea level rise, protecting the properties, either doing all that retreating stuff or armoring. Then you have another state agency saying that, we have a housing crisis and we need to build more housing. Well, for all the coastal cities, how do you do that? You only can go in one direction, and we're limited by our boundaries. And for a city, and a lot of the coastal cities we're built out. We've already been built out. And so now we're looking at, do we have to upzone properties? And for Newport, a lot of our properties are in the coastal zone. So now I got sea level rise, and then I got to turn around and do an upzone. So, it's typical government, it doesn't make sense on one hand when you're trying to defend yourself on sea level rise. And then on the other hand, you got to, add more housing to your housing stock. But back to the question, I think it's an important subject. We're not addressing it at this moment.
Okay. Thank you very much, Simone. I know we're probably pushing up on our time limit here, so I think we ought to move on to Mark here from the city of Laguna Beach. Mark, I don't see your face on my screen here, but I know you're on the call, I believe, right?
Yeah, I'm here. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Weiner. I'm the Community Development Director for the City of Laguna Beach. And climate change is something that we take very importantly. The number one goal in our land use element addresses climate change and greenhouse gases. And we're also a city that's impacted by sea level rise. And you've heard a little bit today about the Coastal Commission and their policy of managed retreats. So we've really been on the receiving end of that policy. We have approximately 500 structures, most of which are homes, but some commercial developments that are located along the bluffs or on the beach. And we've been having issues approving permits for those properties, even for minor repairs. Many of the projects have been appealed to the Coastal Commission. They found issue with allowing improvements to those properties. And part of that is due to some of the ambiguity in our zoning code. So we did recently get a local coastal program amendment through that helps provide some clarification on what level of repairs you can do. But we are trying to address the larger issue through another local coastal program amendments. And what we're trying to do for those bluff properties is establish setback standards, development standards, and further clarification on the limitations to repair and remodel. So one of the Coastal Commission's primary concerns is the erosion of the shoreline. And they don't want to allow new development or improvements that would extend the life of these buildings in that area. You know, as we've said, they want managed retreats, and they don't want these structures to warrant the need for armoring of the shoreline. So to address this issue as part of our local coastal program amendments, we actually did a geotechnical study of our shoreline, and it was positive. It showed that over 90% is stable, not prone to erosion. So our approach is going to be to have a different set of standards for the erosion prone versus the stable and the rest of the city, because we really think that the erosion prone areas should be treated separately, and it's not really a one size fits all. We have submitted that draft LCP amendment to the Coastal Commission. We are awaiting formal feedback from them, but I know that there's a lot of residents in the city that want some clarity on this. We just had a number of issues over the past few years, and we've been working hard to resolve it. So all that said, you know, we are a city that's impacted by sea level rise. It impacts our development standards, and the Coastal Commission, you know, always kind of, you know, they're our partner in this, but they do have a strong say in what it is that we're going to allow and not allow. So we're working with them on it. And that's really just my brief summary of what we're doing in Laguna Beach, at least one of the things that we're doing to address sea level rise. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Bobby, you see anything there specific to Laguna Beach that I'm missing? I'm looking through the chat and the Q&A here.
I do not see any yet.
Okay, we can circle back if we need to.
Rob, you muted yourself.
Oh, I muted myself. I do that at least once per meeting, just for fun, to make sure that I don't exactly know what I'm doing. Thank you very much, Mark. Very much appreciate that. And we will hand it off to John and Brenda with the City of Dana Point.
Hi, I'll kick things off because we are short for time, and maybe I'll just have John available for questions. So City of Dana Point, my name is Brenda Wisniewski. I'm a Community Development Director here. And when Don was giving his presentation, I felt he was really talking about Dana Point. We have taken advantage of 2 of the Coastal Commission's grants. The first allowed us to create a vulnerability study for the city, which was great. Just told us where we thought our problem areas were, and we basically knew where those were. Now we're on phase 2, and we're getting nervous because some of the things that the Coastal Commission is asking us to do, we're not quite ready for. And I think that it's not providing us the flexibility that we really need in a time of uncertainty of sea level rise. So we're stuck in a situation of trying to help part of our city. We have about 180 single family homes along Beach Road. They're right on the sand. So sometimes we do have the situation, probably not as extreme as that picture from Ventura, where the wave was coming through the window, but it does get that bad pretty much. And so we're trying to help those homeowners figure out how to deal with things. You know, they are out there illegally building up sand berms and putting in sea walls at the detriment of probably in the near future being receiving violation notice from the Coastal Commission. So we're trying to help them figure out what they need to do as far as maintaining their property and also looking forward to potential redevelopment. So that is one side of things. So I'm dealing with this issue of today, but probably more on the promising side is we are looking at working with some of the regional agencies we recently signed on to a grant application for developing a regional sediment management program. So hopefully we'll be seeing an artificial reef or something like that here in the city of Dana Point that can show those great results that Don showed you there. So we are just trying to figure things out ourselves, and the Coast Commission, as hopefully we won't have such an extreme as what Mark is having in Laguna Beach of appealing our projects, but we're trying to help them out in that situation. So in the interest of time, that is what's happening in Dana Point.
Okay, thank you very much, Brenda. Very much appreciate that. Also want to let you know that we also have Cecilia Gallardo Daly that joined us from the city of San Clemente, and I want to see if she's got anything that she would like to add to what the city of San Clemente may be doing on their end.
Thanks. I appreciate the time. I'll just let everyone know what we've done briefly. Cecilia Gallardo Daly, Community Development Director. We have completed a sea level rise vulnerability assessment to identify areas in the city that might be vulnerable to the rising seas in the future. Our study projects out from now until 2130. And we looked at exposure to hazards, sensitivity to coastal hazards, and adaptivity capacity. We looked at the magnitude of sea level rise in San Clemente and what scenarios could happen and by when. So what we've done is we've inventoried all of those resources that could potentially be impacted, and the scenarios vary depending on the railroad revetment. San Clemente is pretty fortunate in that we have the low sand corridor that runs along our coastline that protects a lot of our coastal bluff. Unfortunately, it also acts as a mechanism to foster something called coastal squeeze. When you have wave run up or wave inundation on the coast, and then you have a revetment, that sand area is narrowed and narrowed and narrowed up against that revetment. So in terms of adaptation strategies, we are working with OCTA. They're currently conducting a study on climate change and its impact on all their infrastructure. Whether it's roadways or the rail line. So we're looking at potential opportunities to strengthen that railroad revetment, and looking at some potential future beach nourishment projects because where the railroad has existing rock revetment that they have to keep replacing is in areas where we no longer have a beach. So to the extent that we can keep our beaches as wide as possible, that actually helps or proves to be a benefit to the rail corridor as well. So we are working on some active things, but yes, the Coastal Commission is a force to be reckoned with in all this, certainly. And I'm available for questions. Thank you.
Very well said. That seems to be a common theme. It's not easy working through that process.
Yes.
Are there any other questions anybody see that needs to be addressed in there? I knew a few more
Yeah.
popped in there towards the tail end.
Yes, so for Dana Point, how will they combat this sea level rise for the new condos by the harbor at the base of San Juan Creek?
So yes, they're in the process of approving, I think there are 190 condos there that fortunately they're under construction now. So there was a point that we raised those above the anticipated flood levels. So those should be safe for somewhat huge future. Anticipated life of the structure like 75 years. And hopefully they'll be safe for that period.
Thank you. There's a couple attendees with their hands up. Janine, do you have a question for the panelists? You need to unmute yourself. Okay. Paulo? would you like to ask a question? No? Okay, well then we can move on.
One more in there for Simone, still on the call. I see one in there from Carol that was tied to, I think, height limits on housing for, I could probably summarize this a little bit, for houses that where you're requiring them to build from a higher foundation level. Are you adjusting the maximum height level of the structure tied to the required raising of your foundation level?
Right. So there are some properties that are in the FEMA flood zones that have to kind of start off at a higher elevation. Some of them are like maybe instead of our standard 9 feet, they're up to the 14 feet now. So we do give you that extra height. So you're not compacted at the 27-foot height limit. You can go up that extra 4 or 5 feet because you have to start off at a higher elevation. So that is you get to go up a little higher too.
Thank you, Simone. And I saw one more pop in here for Dana Point too, regarding the harbor redesign and sea level rise. Is it high enough to not be impacted?
Yeah, fortunately, the harbor is existing seawalls are adequate to accommodate the new developments happening there. They're going to be rebuilding them, but I don't believe the height of those seawalls are going to have to be increased.
Yeah, I think that got us through all of our questions there, unless somebody sees somebody else. But I would really enjoy, after hearing some of that back and forth, to hear like maybe some closing comments from both Don Schmitz and Dr. Gary Griggs, if you would like to help walk us through to the finish line here.
Gary, you want to go first? Is Gary still with us?
I don't know if he's still with us, but while we've got you, let's hear after what you've heard back, a lot of questions and some back and forth from different cities. Would love to hear some closing thoughts from you.
Yeah, I imagine that my closing thought would be, we are in a major way, we are watching sausage get made here, and it's going to be ugly. And there is not a one size fits all solution to what it is that we are grappling with, but grapple with it we must. That is what the state law is, numerous state laws in regards to the sea level rising. And the backstop to all that is not just necessarily Pacific Coast Highway and property boundaries, but the constitutional constraints. And there's been a lot of folks which have ignored that for a long period of time. But the local cities and counties simply do not have that luxury. And so in conjunction with the vulnerability assessments that so many of the cities and counties, I think probably most of them that are represented on this call, have done with grants from the state to identify where these different levels of sea level rise will impact their communities, there really needs to be some economic considerations in regards to this. There has been conversations and discussions, and it's billions of dollars. And for some of these communities, some are more vulnerable than others, but some of them simply will cease to exist by and large should they allow the ocean to come in without any sort of physical steps taken to protect their communities in some of these very important neighborhoods. So I just want to close by saying, Smart Coast California is not just simply pounding its fist on the podium and saying it's all about property rights, because it's not. It's also about the environment. It's also about good land use planning. We are an incredibly dynamic state, and one of the things that we've conveyed to lawmakers and to decision makers is that when it comes to understanding the local communities and passing out information to property owners, there's no group really that is better situated than the realtors organizations to understand their communities and to assist the planning departments and the decision makers within their communities to liaison with the Coastal Commission. So we're very excited to keep working with everybody to find those solutions. Do feel free to contact my firm directly or Smart Coast California or your local GAD or organization of realtors. and Association of Realtors, excuse me. And we'll keep working away at this. I do believe, and this is the last word, that there's a number of coastal commissioners who recognize that there will have to be compromises, and that they're going to have to allow these communities to take certain steps to protect themselves. And so 2021 is going to be, it's going to be a very important year on the issue of land use planning and sea level rise.
All right, well, I think that's a great way to close out, Don. And I want to say thank you to you, and thank you to Dr. Griggs, and thank you to all of our wonderful people from the cities on our coast. I know everybody is very passionate about our communities and protecting them. And I want to say thank you to the Newport Beach Association of Realtors, the Laguna Beach Association of Realtors, the Orange County Realtors for help putting this together and collaborating as we always do. I love to see that community effort and putting this together for all of our members. So thank you all very much for your time, and appreciate you all being here, and have a fantastic rest of the day. And we will see you out and about somewhere soon.
Thank you. Take care.
Great job, Rob.